Well, welcome everybody. Again, as I mentioned, my name is Tom DiLiberto. I'm with NOAA's Climate Program Office. I'll be one of the moderators here today. This is a really exciting kind of campaign that's being put on this summer. As you can see here with this slide here, it's 13 different cities are taking place in mapping the urban heat island campaign. And we have this roundtable discussion that's being put on by not only us at NOAA's Climate Program Office, but our friends Climate Central and Climate Matters. And we have basically the way we're going to set up this roundtable is that we're going to have first 3 panelists give little presentations on different aspects of this campaign. We'll have Hunter Jones, the Climate Health Project Manager in NOAA's Climate Program Office, to give kind of the broader scope of why this campaign to map urban heat islands came into existence, the aspects of the national level campaign, the larger idea of why this campaign is occurring. We'll have Vivek Chandas also then come on and talk more about the technical aspects. Thank you very much. Then also talk about more of the technical aspects. How is this mapping actually going to take place? What is actually being done in each of these 13 cities this summer? And then we'll have Julia Kumara-Draken talk about the community aspects, what's going on in each individual city. She's going to explain like how each of these cities is going to be pulling this off. Before we get into those interesting speakers, you'll have to listen to me talk about boring rules and reminders for a second. The agenda for this basically is about the first 30 minutes we'll have the panelists talk, the next 30 minutes will be for Q&A. Throughout that entire time while the panelists are talking, I encourage all of you to ask questions in the chat window. You can see the chat window in the GoToMeeting little area. Ask a question, please do during the entirety of those panelists' conversations. Importantly, note who you are asking the question to. The answer part of that process will come after all the panelists talk during the 30 minutes of Q&A, but please feel free to ask questions throughout the entire time. Again, also one other aspect is make sure your full name is available in the attendees list. And again, to mute your phone just so we don't hear any background noises when we going through. But that's it for me. I'd like to introduce my colleague and the other moderator here today, Bernadette Woods-Plackey from Climate Matters and Climate Central. So Bernadette.
Thank you, Tom. And I would like everyone just take a moment and check to see if they're on mute or not, because someone isn't and it's causing some noise here. Okay, thank you so much. Really just want to thank Tom also for working together on this project. This is such a neat campaign on so many different levels. I mean, the findings are not good news, but from the aspect of science and storytelling and ways of connecting with your audience and your public, there's a lot of really interesting information that's packed into this campaign. And when I was talking with Tom about this, it just seemed like a natural partnership to get this in front of our entire network. So this is such an interesting opportunity for you to engage with your audience from the citizen science level and have an ongoing series, really, from the prep of what's going to be happening straight through when heat does kick in and how this actually operates, straight through to the end as you're going to hear from some of the reports and the findings that'll be put together. And there's so many different stories packed into what's going to happen here, from the aspect of equity and where we do have these really intense heat islands, straight through to the science, to the infrastructure, to the people stories that are living in these areas. So we're going to get into all of that afterwards, but I just kind of really wanted to get that out in front of everybody that this is such a cool opportunity. Thank you for joining us today. And at this point, I'll hand it back over to Tom so we can start learning more.
Thanks. And I'll be pretty quick with this. I'm going to go kick us right into our panelist discussion. I will note that this has been formally announced. There's an article which I could put in a chat window once our first panelist speaks. If this has been announced by the Climate Program Office, you can go to an article on that to get a little bit more of the details on that. But why not hear it from one of the people who are actually pulling off this campaign? So let me introduce Hunter Jones from the Climate Program Office to talk a little bit more about the campaign. And I will make him a presenter once I find his name. All right, Hunter, you are the presenter.
Great, thank you. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, So let's get started. So yeah, as Tom mentioned, I'm Hunter Jones, the Climate and Health Project Manager in the NOAA Climate Program Office. And I am, from a NOAA perspective, coordinating this campaign with Vivek, who you'll hear from in a moment, and a number of other people who are involved. There's a really long list. We actually just had a cohort call with all the cities prior to this, and I was really happy to see there were over 50 people on that call. So it really is a great community effort. So I'm going to kind of walk through the programmatic aspect of this. Actually, mostly explaining this. Sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. Mostly explaining this acronym here at the front, NIHIS, and then kind of getting a little bit into why we are really excited about these campaigns. And then, okay, so there are a lot of things popping up on my screen. And then moving into getting ready to transition to Vivek, who's going to cover the science and sort of how he runs these campaigns. So really quickly, what is NIHIS? NIHIS is the National Integrated Heat Health Information System. It actually some of the impetus. Okay, some of the impetus for NIHIS came from a workshop that we ran in Chicago in 2015 on the anniversary of the Chicago heat wave of 1995. So we had this workshop that convened a number of partners from across the federal agencies, from across other organizations, and even from other countries, and really realized that we could do a lot more to bring together all the people who are trying to address the issue of extreme heat in our communities across the US and even globally. So we launched NIHIS in June of 2015. The workshop was actually in July. So we knew that we were planning on launching this, but the workshop really helped us solidify why we were doing this and how we could structure it. And really quickly, NIHIS grew to include representation from a number of agencies that you can see represented here on the right in the form of an interagency working group, which one of its first actions was to launch the NIHIS portal, which I believe you have as a URL that you can access. That's where we're also putting all the urban heat island mapping information. And we also run local pilots. So these are actually slightly different from the urban heat island campaigns, or at least they were initially. The local pilots were really kind of local workshops to help us define the demand for improved climate, weather, and health information to support decision makers to reduce heat health issues in their communities. But those local pilots often took the form of highly interdisciplinary workshops, representation from health, emergency management, from the energy sector, because we know there are a lot of different people who need to be involved in managing heat in cities. But now the urban heat island programs are starting to take on some of that local pilot flavor as well. So some of the activities that we engage in are prototyping new products that integrate information from different agencies, different disciplines. We do decision counter exercises to understand the context and the need for that information. And then these heat island campaigns, which I'll talk about. Really quickly, the background on why we're doing this, I think this is well known, but we know that heat waves have been getting worse and are projected to continue to get worse. And you can see on the left a figure from the National Climate Assessment showing that we're expecting roughly 20 to 30 more days per year with a maximum over 90 Fahrenheit in most areas by mid-century under the highest emission scenario. Of course, there's a lot of variability across the nation in terms of that, and you can see that here. Also from the EPA CO2 report, you can see the impact that extreme temperatures have on the country. Right now, what's showing in the bubble for extreme temperature mortality is the economic impact. But you can see that in addition to extreme temperature mortality, which is one of the biggest impacts that they highlight, impacts to labor, and that is temperature related, as well as electricity demand and supply, are also represented here. So these have huge economic impacts, and that same report estimated that by there's a net average increase of 9,300 premature deaths per year under the RCP 8.5 scenario by 2090 in 49 modeled cities. And then lastly, we know that the world is urbanizing and people are moving to cities. So this is an example of one of the experimental products NIHIS is working on to address extreme heat. We worked with our partners in CDC and with Esri in the private sector to develop this dashboard that combines CDC's Social Vulnerability Index and NOAA's predictions of temperatures going into the future. And I won't go into a lot of detail on how this works, but I would encourage everybody to look at this dashboard. It's really cool, and combining those layers is really important to kind of get the full picture of vulnerability and heat risk, because it's not just a hazard. And so this tool actually lets you drill down into the census level information and see how vulnerability is distributed and what the temperature projections will be. We know that in addition to that national scale product I just showed you, that cities in particular are struggling to address extreme heat. And we know that that's the area, that's the level of government that takes a lot of actions to protect people. And so you can see from some of these news clippings, outdoor sports events being canceled in New York. Louisville saw that its heat island was among the warmest in the nation. And so they're taking action now by planting trees and doing other things to mitigate that. And we also know that conventional strategies and approaches like making sure everybody has air conditioning are good, but they don't solve all the problems. And there are some side effects to using air conditioning as well. It might increase greenhouse gas emissions. It assumes that everybody will be able to afford paying for their air conditioning. So it's not a complete solution. So how can we help cities address these problems? This is just a really quick sample of some of the interventions and the actions that cities are taking and putting in place to protect people from extreme heat. All of these interventions are useful in particular contexts, but they might have some complexities, some effects that need to be taken under consideration when you're deciding where to place them. So understanding how the urban heat island is distributed in your city is really important, so you know which of these interventions or which combination you should actually be applying in certain places. And that's why this information is really valuable from a scientific and decision-making perspective. So NOAA is working with Kappa Strategies to support a number of cities in mapping their urban heat island. And this is just one example. This is what it looks like in DC. My eyes immediately go right to where I live, and I can see that I'm in one of the orange spots. So I'm in one of the warmer parts of the city, though a good portion of it is. So this really is helpful in a number of ways. It shows me how the heat's distributed, but it also, in these campaigns, because they're community science campaigns, empowers people to, because they're co-producing this information, empowers them to feel like this is information that they developed and they can share. So it's a really good way for the community to take part in the action in reducing the urban heat island. So ever since 2017, NOAA has been engaged with Vivek of Kappa Strategies in working on these campaigns. It was initially started by the Office of Education, but we've taken it from there in the Climate Program Office, and over the past several years, including this year, are adding more and more cities. So this is my last slide, and it just shows, kind of echoing just a slightly different version, where we're going to run these campaigns this year. So I'm really excited that we have a larger number of cities going than we have in the past. We're scaling up these mapping campaigns, trying to make sure that as many cities as possible can have this information. So these cities all applied to be a part of this program and to get some funding from NOAA. Many of them are co-funding, which allows us to stretch the funds even further. And I'm really excited by the number of partners that these cities are bringing into this mapping effort as well. So I will stop there and transition to Vivek, who will be able to explain how these campaigns are actually run.
Okay. Thanks, Hunter. That was great. And Vivek, I believe you are now the presenter. Thank you. Oh, perfect.
All right. Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Bernadette. Thank you, Tom. My name is Vivek Chandas. Presume you can hear me okay. We've started, as Hunter's describing, we started this actually originally back in 2005 with a National Science Foundation grant to try to understand how we can actually get higher resolution descriptions of the distribution of ambient or air temperature in and around our cities. And so this has been a long-standing process to try to, over the last 15 years, to really try to get at some of what we're doing today. And what you'll see, at least in this summary, is a lot of what we've learned over the time in doing these campaigns. So I want to start with just a general overview. As many of you may know, this urban heat process has been around for a long time. This is not necessarily new, and that's my first point I want to make. This is something that we've observed over time. We've seen this as the dome over cities, and we've seen that cities really are highlighted in a lot of the satellite imagery that's come out describing the urban heat island as the map of the CONUS United States. down in the bottom right illustrates. And so a few of the things that have been done, at least in the last 30, 40 years, is the creation of this reference site. So often what's been done in the past is someplace rural will have a temperature, humidity, and measurement stationary monitor, and then there'll be another one in the city. And what you're essentially doing is looking at the difference between the rural area and the urban area, and you're able to actually assess those differences over time. And those provide you a spatial distinction between those two, or among many more. And you can also get at a kind of a temporal resolution. So you're starting to get at what happens in the night when some areas of the city don't actually let go of all that heat that they've gained through the solar radiation throughout the day. And so that's been pretty much a long-standing canon of literature that is in this field that's really well represented. And that has been complemented more recently by the launching of several satellites, including Landsat 8, which really picks up on aspects of atmospheric brightness, emissivity, and fundamentally a lot of the long wave radiation, which is what is coming back out from all the surfaces that have absorbed the short wave radiation that's come down from the sun's rays. And so this is kind of the background of what's been happening in this field. And arguably this has been a relatively technical exercise. It's been done often in labs. It's been done with lots of very sophisticated modeling systems. And coming into this, one of the things I have really wanted to try to get a better handle on is how can we bring this out to communities? How can we actually take these activities and be a little bit more engaged with them, so that people who are feeling the differences when they're standing in a parking lot and then walking into a park, they're actually able to experience those differences. And so we came up with this approach where I'm going to just put together a set of processes here where when we used to be able to convene together as a group in the upper left image, which is out of Baltimore when we did a campaign there, we would essentially engage communities, usually working through a local community-based organization, and who has been involved in social or environmental justice issues often, and that links us to be able to engage them in a sensor data collection process. So we go out, we create these maps for a particular area, such as Washington, D.C. here. We're able to draw these polygons as well as these traverse routes. And so each of these areas have specific traverse routes that are created. Then that is essentially the means by which community members go out and collect data measurements, temperature and humidity, once every second for an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, an hour in the evening. And they're able to get at that diurnal profile of the temperature in a particular area. And we really ask them to go through very diverse land use and land cover types. So that would mean drive or bike. Some people have rode their bikes with instruments on them, and they essentially go out and they collect temperature and humidity measurements in residential areas, single family residential, multifamily, in commercial areas, etc. And that gives us a real diverse set of measurements of what's on the landscape and what temperature and humidity is in that location. And we link that to a series of machine learning models that allow us to identify the predictive factors for that temperature and that humidity. And these are remarkably well-performing machine learning models. We've got several publications on this, happy to direct you to those. And the outputs really move towards creating these, as you saw from Hunter's slide, these high resolution, often 10 meter or in some cases even 1 meter resolution descriptions of the distribution of air temperature and humidity. And then with those two, we can even develop a heat index for specific places. These have been linked to climate action plans. These have been linked to public health campaigns. These have been linked to urban forestry programs, and even to a certain extent land use planning and rezoning of particular places. So this has, and we revisit the community and engage them in these processes. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, though I do just kind of break this down from a preparation, execution, and interpretation of the process. So a local community organizer would recruit about 10 to 60 volunteers, depending on the size of the region. They're assigned, as I mentioned, to these polygons. They drive or bike in these areas, and we have this kind of step-by-step process that we take them through from 10 to 12 weeks before the campaign, all the way to 6 to 10 weeks after the campaign. And it's essentially set up so that they can go out, instrument their vehicles or their bikes, and go out with these 3 periods during the day. They can have we do this all online now, so there's no exposure to COVID or no exposure to coronavirus or any other concerns that we have now. So we've retooled this entire process to do all the trainings online, to have little parcels of equipment that volunteers would pick up at a location where they're maintaining distance, much like a grocery store pickup or a parking lot pickup, if you will. And they essentially have same household navigators if they have one, and they have maps and all this materials in front of them, and they're able to go through these routes. And after they finish the routes on that day, they return the equipment, and they have a bumper sticker, Science in Motion, that they can put on their cars as they're going out and doing this, or a sticker on their bicycle as they're going out and doing this as well. In terms of the outputs, these are some of the images. For example, Boston from last year had a very successful campaign where they were able to look at Boston, Cambridge, as well as Brookline. And we are able to record the high temperature, the low temperature, mean, and then across these different time periods. And these individual measurements end up with about 100,000 plus or minus 20,000. And those help inform this machine learning model, which generates a set of continuous, if you're following me on the mapping side of things, the continuous raster imagery, where we're able to then get it down to a description of the hottest and coolest places. In this case, the red being the hottest and the blue being the coolest. That then finally links to a interpretation where we work with the local communities and generate a report, work with local communities, survey them as to how it went, and then explore applications of some of the results to various community-based programs that might be underway. So with that, let me end and leave some contact information. If you have any interest in talking to me about the Talking Shop, I'd be happy to check in with you about that. And I will stop my presentation there and turn it back over to Tom.
Thank you so much. And to move right on to our third panelist, it's Julie Kamari-Drapkin. You are now the presenter.
Hi, y'all.
Hello.
I am now the presenter. Hi. All right, I'm hoping this works this time. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yay. I'm gonna minimize me. Awesome. Oh, it's not full screen, is it? Oh.
Oh yeah, you might have to just double click it. I think you're showing the entire screen. So if you just make your...
No. Double click my screen.
Yeah.
You think that someone who does digital media for a living would be able to handle this. Hold on one second. One more time. Share screen. Nope. Share screen. Okay. There we go. I think that's the one. It was applications. Better?
That looks good.
All right. Yeah, buddy. Now we're kicking with gas. All right. Hi, y'all. I'm Julia Kamari-Drapkin. I think my role is to kind of help everyone understand, well, why would community members want to be involved in this? Like, what is the value of this in a way that an engineer, does mapping, or NOAA does mapping, or what's in it for communities? And at IC Change, we work with communities across the country to document climate impacts and microdata, and that includes environmental and health impacts from heat. We see cities and engineers struggling to prioritize and target solutions as extreme events happen more often, but they're often relying on either outdated data or just on statistical models alone, which means they're looking at climate change like this, or like this, or instead of like this, with real people at the center of this process. So I'm the founder of IC Change. I spent more than a decade as a climate science reporter, seeing top-down technical solutions failing to meet local needs. Basically, when cities are struggling to engage their residents in making solutions, it erodes public trust and it misses valuable insights that could save us all time, money, and frustration. In New Orleans, where we'll be mapping our urban heat campaign, we've been seeing this play out with flooding. IC Change is a community climate dialogue platform. It lets municipalities, engineers, and scientists collaborate with residents before, during, and after infrastructure and adaptation investments. So I'm going to just run us through a little bit of an example of, again, why this data can matter and how it plays out. So we channel the knowledge and the experience of community members to share their climate stories via phone or computer. And they can also add real-time details that help validate and improve the models that we're making. And this is also helping communities adapt to climate change. And this is another example from flooding, where we quadrupled the amount of feedback and data collected from traditional engagement, traditional meetings, which is how things are usually done. Residents were able to document disruptive flooding and add hyperlocal data and details that supported major design decisions across 2 multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects in the Gentilly Resilience District. And in the same neighborhood, we're doing this for heat. By working with us, engineers are learning the value of community voices and data in precise technical work. And this brings us to our work with NOAA and CAPA, as well as the other 13 communities who are participating in the sensor mapping project this summer. Where people post about flooding on IC Change, we often see urban heat island impacts and health inequities as well. And we started working with the New Orleans Health Department last year. Because we really don't understand heat exposure very well, and especially in the South. It's where we assume everybody either has AC or everybody has to live with heat. But through dialogue with people and looking at the data, we know that conditions vary wildly, both outside and inside. Now, we've worked on a variety of heat sensing projects before. In 2016, in partnership with WNYC, which is a local radio station, We Act for Environmental Justice, which is a local community group, and Harlem Adapt and Adapt NY, we put temperature sensors inside apartments without AC units to model indoor urban heat waves, which behave very differently than outdoor heat waves. So if you are covering heat in the Northeast, most people don't have ACs inside their buildings. And then we asked residents to tell their stories about dealing with the heat, which we synced to the sensor's data feed. So this is Helen Jones. She's in her 80s. She's taking care of her 4-year-old grandson. Those are the 2 demographics who are most impacted by urban heat and least heard from. And she had one of the hottest sensors in the system. So really understanding not only what is the heat, but who is impacted and how is how we really start to understand how this can help us make decisions. And there are micro differences outside too, not just in buildings that trap heat, but this is from one of our partners at Georgia Tech who maps heat with stationary sensors. In a matter of blocks, you can go from having 53 days of unhealthy heat in summer next to an area that only experiences 7 unhealthy days out of the summer. So we started installing outdoor sensors in New Orleans, and our goal was to compare them to bigger picture data networks and trigger iterative engagement directly with our residents to yield more powerful insights about heat and health issues. Data can and should be a dialogue. And we've seen some really interesting results from this work and that have impacted how we plan green infrastructure in New Orleans. We have local community groups who have been hosting these sensors. This is in the 7th Ward, Healthy Community Services. As a part of a Thriving Earth Exchange project, we put these sensors out to map the impact of cooling, of planting trees. This is a park that has almost none, but it's really hard to do granular heat sensing work like this at scale. So we're expanding our partnerships to work with CAPA and NOAA this year to do heat mapping with citizens driving the sensors. We're really excited. The timing is just perfect for us. And we learned a lot about CAPA's work when we partnered with the Museum of Science in Boston last year. Since only a limited group can commit to car mapping, the museum used IC Change to engage a wider group of citizens to add hyperlocal context alongside the larger heat mapping work. So this effort produced some of the most interesting details and dialogue we've seen on icy change, really understanding the context in which heat and the data kind of overlap, and what does that mean as our communities have been changing over time. We saw city officials posting about what they wanted residents to know about. We also saw details about how people and even their pets adapt to hot conditions. And in New Orleans, we plan to do the same, asking residents to hear asking residents that we hear from the least to tell us what we need to hear the most. And you know, in the context of COVID, you know, we really are leaning into our media partners, local community groups, like doing this virtually and remotely. One thing that's new, we'll be testing out with Kappa and NOAA in New Orleans, and potentially I think Austin is also maybe trying this out, is the use of infrared cameras to post pictures of heat differences that we can sync to the car mapping effort. We are interested in trying it indoors as well to assess energy and efficiency inside homes, and we've been reaching out to energy auditors to maybe comment on what we're seeing on as we post these pictures on icy change. But the more we understand the relationship between our built environment and our climate risks, the more we can get beyond criticism and work together for collaborative solutions. So the takeaways from the community's perspective are: one, you know, heat is an invisible health threat that the mapping exercises make visible. Each city in the cohort would benefit from anyone, from the TV meteorologist on the call, from local media on the call. Any one of the cities would really benefit your help in recruiting volunteers to drive, as well as for people to participate in wider efforts and telling stories. It's not each neighborhood that is experiencing heat differently, it's also each neighbor. So again, this is such a unique experience. And community stories combined with data can really help us understand those impacts and target better solutions. Icy Change is doing heat and flooding projects in Miami, New Orleans, and Boston, but our app and our platform are available to anyone, anywhere to use. Our community spans the United States as well as 118 countries. We are open-armed collaborators and are happy to be in touch anytime. But if there's one thing I can leave you with all, and I come to this with the greatest of humility and gratitude to my NOAA and Kappa partners. But when you're engaging your audiences, I think one thing to keep in mind that a truly smart, climate resilient city is one that is centered around its smartest sensors. It's people. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Julia. And that ends the panelist discussion. Really interesting stuff from all three of you. I think it really kind of set the stage of what actually is going to be happening in the cities. I'm going to make myself the presenter, and I'm going to pop up here on the screen. I can figure out how to make myself my own presenter. Here we go. I have some contact information. I can make this let's not. Some little contact information for folks who, when we get into the Q&A section here. A list of the speakers we just had. Thank you so much, by the way, Hunter, Vivek, and Julia. For the campaign itself, if you're curious about it now, if you want to come back to this later during the summer and you want to know who to contact, I've included the contact for the Urban Heat Island Mapping Campaign. It's Monica Allen. She's Director of Public Affairs for NOAA Research and OAR Research here at NOAA. So she's going to be the person who you're going to want to contact. I have her phone number up there and her email address, especially for any media requests as we get through later on. And I also have included Climate Matters and Bernadette's contact information there. So with that said, now is the time to get your questions in. You can ask your questions in two ways. Feel free to put them on in the chat window. If you will note, during Hunter's talk, he mentioned the various sites in his talk. I've included the links to those sites in the chat window right now if you want to go take a look at those or at least bookmark them for later use. But you could either ask your question in the chat window or feel free to unmute yourself. I may have muted all of you during the call, but feel free to unmute yourself now and ask questions in either way. Thank you all.
We did have a couple of questions we could jump in on as people are getting their questions in, Tom, that in our prep call with this group that had come up that in our conversation that was so great that I want to share with the rest of the group here. And really one thing to kind of tell everyone who's been calling in and joining this discussion today, we really look at this as the beginning of a relationship. This was to kick off that relationship. We can follow up with those of you who do want to do more coverage on this or join this campaign somehow or cover it somehow. Monica, Tom, myself, we can help direct you to your specific cities and the contacts in those cities so that you can dive deeper there. Another thing too is that we will be following up with a package of resources here on extreme heat. As you guys know, Climate Central has created a bunch of them, so has NOAA. So Tom and I are going to go through and kind of package all of that together. I should use this moment to say that those who haven't noticed, we've also been doing a COVID and disasters reporting series at Climate Central with the International Association of Emergency Managers and many others who have joined in that discussion. And we will be doing ones focused specifically on heat coming up on the 24th. The invite will be going out soon, so do look for that so we can dive deeper into this specific subject. And one other sort of just housekeeping issue here to follow up with before we dive even deeper is that for those who are starting to, ponder how best to apply this, there are a few ideas I want to get you thinking about here in the range of stories that I've seen from hearing about this project and having conversations about it. It's clear that it's a health story. We know that. It's also an environmental justice story on so many levels, and that is incredibly timely right now. We know it's a climate action plan story, and it's also an infrastructure story. This builds into solutions too. You saw Hunter put up some of those different localized versions of solutions. It goes into design and technology, architecture. We've also got the citizen science engagement, really bringing your audience in on your storytelling here. And then the impacts of this extreme heat is so pervasive from the sports. We already talked about that there, the ways of life, the triathlon that was canceled. I mean, these are just things that are going on in communities that have to really rethink how they do things because of this extreme heat. So those are just some things to get you thinking about the storytelling here. And one more piece, for the Boston series that went on last year, kind of funny story, David Sittenfeld was at a conference with me. And for those who don't know him, he works at the Science Museum there, and he was helping with this campaign. And it was really funny because he had to leave the conference early because the heat was coming. He saw the forecast. He's like, that's it. They shifted his talk. He was able to get out of there and kickstart this. So I guess the first question I really want to bring up to our panelists is, we know this is going to start at different times in different cities based on the actual weather, but how do you define heat in your different cities? What is it that we want to be looking out for? When do you really kick this plan into action? Any of you can jump in.
I think they've been asking us to map out when peak heat is happening in each of our towns. So historically, in the 30-year average, where I believe the city of New Orleans has actually been seeing it in July, but I think the data that y'all were sharing showed us in like that first couple weeks in August. But it is, trying to hit the hottest day. I think that one of the challenges that we had about with Tom and NOAA folks and Vivek was, mapping it according to, in particular, we have these monsoonal rain events. So they cool our city real fast. But trying to time it is challenging. So we do need to be able to recruit volunteers who'd be open to being flexible with their time, potentially on a weekend. That's a big ask. So we do really need to kind of go wide to our communities to help us maybe cover, maybe both a Saturday and a Sunday shift.
And Bernadette, that's a really great question. Perhaps Hunter and Vivek, you can maybe go more a little bit about the timeline, because I think it's a really good point in terms of when these mapping campaigns happen. I mean, you can't plan out when it's going to be the hottest day of the year until you get closer to when the forecast says it's going to be the hottest day of the year. So what are the mechanisms built into this campaign that alert the people within the city that basically it's time to go. It's time to put the instruments on the cars, the bikes, and it's time to, and the bumper stickers on the back of the car, and it's time to go.
Tom, could you share the map again? I don't know if you have it in have it handy since you're showing your screen, because that's a great start to answering this question. So this map is actually from climate.gov. It's just one of the many pieces of information that we'll use to help the campaigns decide when to run their mapping, so their local data collection. So what this background map is showing, and we didn't go into a lot of detail on this just for the sake of time, but hoping that we'd get some questions about it, is the warmest day of the year. This is a climatological average, so it's not necessarily going to be what happens this year, but it just gives us a sense of when we expect it to be at its hottest in these different places. And so you can see places like Las Cruces and El Paso there are a lot of other factors to consider aside from just temperature. We actually have to, Vivek can probably go into more details on this, but they're moving the gear around to different cities and things like that. But those two cities in the Southwest tends to get hot really early, and are good. They're important to catch early on because once the monsoonal rains start coming in, they might be too moist and the temperatures will drop. So you can kind of trace the color pattern from lighter to darker orange to see how we might try to run these campaigns. In addition to this climatological information, we're working with the National Weather Service. Kind of helps to have them handy on speed dial if you're inside NOAA. So the rest of us are in the research arm of NOAA on this call, but the National Weather Service and the weather forecast offices that are distributed across the entire United States and all operate on a smaller subset of the area of the United States. The appropriate weather forecast offices are actually plugged into these campaigns and members of the local teams, and they're there to help answer questions and help them target the right dates to get the campaigns off the ground. And then we also have sub-seasonal predictions and weather scale predictions from the Climate Prediction Center and the Weather Prediction Center of NOAA that are also being provided. So a lot of information is going into making these decisions.
I might just add, this is Vivek, I might just add just briefly that part of this campaign is twofold that builds on what Hunter was describing. Is we have first the kind of local knowledge that people have. We have come to them, I've noticed in past campaigns, we've come to them with incredible, like sophisticated models of months out of prediction that NOAA's produced, and there'll be a local person who will just say, you know what, that week when we have that jazz festival, like that is always the hottest week of the year, and we're gonna really use that. And so they rely both on this kind of top-down, if you will, or kind of big climate model approach, and then the bottom-up community perspective, and what you can really get some civic legitimacy around in terms of the community buy-in for these campaigns. Like, oh yeah, that jazz festival for sure. Let's really think about that. Let's see what the hottest day of the year is historically, which helped to corroborate some of those perceptions, and then really kind of coming to that date. And we've had times where people have said, hey, this date and this week looks like, now that we're 6 days out, 7 days out, it doesn't look really the best day to be doing this. So let's revise what it is that we want to identify as a date, and it requires a little bit of nimbleness among the volunteers that are participating, and hopefully that's set forward by the local organizer at the beginning. And the second piece is just that this is really a lot, like even getting that date is a lot about building partnerships. So in cases like, for example, Honolulu last year, it was really wonderful to see the connection between the local meteorology community and the urban and the sustainability community coming together with the local nonprofits that were working on some of these campaigns, and it really and the university, and it really created this kind of mix of people and organizations that could all work together. And ideally, if we're really talking about dealing with heat, we have to find ways to build these networks and connections a little bit more explicitly. So I'll leave it at that as at least a date discussion.
So that brings us to
I would add one more thing. Oh, sorry. A lot of the partners in this cohort are from the cities themselves, including our partner, which is the Department of Health. And we can see that some of the early research that we've done is around mapping 911 heat calls. So I think a lot of the mapping that we do is going to really be complemented by a lot of the city data that's going to be done after the mapping, so we can kind of see patterns about when in the year it's, you know, we need to pay attention to too.
Interesting point. So I do see a couple of questions coming in. Kate, we'll get to yours just a moment. I think Paul's goes along with what we were just talking about here. He said, so what are we asking? And I think it's a couple of things, Paul. One, it was just an introduction of this project because it's going to be going on in your city. And I figured anyone in these cities probably wants to know because you could be a voice and a part in this. But what I'm hearing is one, and I'll let them jump into this more, but how to recruit people to partake in the project. But then two, this giving you an opportunity to be part of the story and get this information out. So Tom, do you want to go into that more?
Right, I think that's a little bit to the timeline. This is, it's not like once the cities are mapped, for instance, that the maps are going to be created like this. There's a time period where you have the mapping period and then they have to collect all the data. All the data is going to come back in, the machine learning has to actually take place and the maps are produced later that year. And then after that aspect of it, you now have these maps, and now the question is what to do with these maps. And as Julia mentioned, a lot of the people who are helping out, or the people on the ground doing this, are actually associated with the cities themselves. And I will, I know a little bit about this in terms of Hunter, and maybe I can go a little more about this in terms of what are some of the things that are being done. I know Honolulu, for instance, this just kind of coincided with a major release that Honolulu did in terms of a big green plan that they had done. This is like one aspect of it, and they kind of took it and ran. Obviously, Boston did amazing things with it too, but perhaps maybe Hunter, if you could also talk about that aspect of it in terms of, okay, great, we got the city mapped, the map is produced. What have some of the past cities been doing with it?
But before we jump into that real quick though too, I think the other point is how, when you guys do talk about how Paul and others on this call can help with the recruiting part at this stage too.
Right.
This is Vivek. Just I would suggest that any kind of news that comes out on this. So if a local media organization puts forward even a small bit on the fact that this is happening and that there is a contact locally to be able to participate, that has really helped, in even if it's a small little blip that we've seen sometimes on the local news. And that has kind of not only brought the fact out that we've seen differences in temperatures in other cities, that we might see that in this city, and it's kind of speculative at first, and then and then to solicit participation through a kind of preemptive mention of it. And then, of course, during the campaign, it's phenomenal to actually have. We've had local news media ride along with us and ask questions, and they've actually in between the 6 a.m. in between the morning, afternoon, and evening campaigns, we've stopped to discuss potential implications of this work, who's involved, what it means, and so it's really trying to bring this information more broadly out to the general public. And knowing that we've been all checking our temperatures since we were kids, it's a relatively easy concept to grasp, I think, for a lot of the communities.
Paul, you can do a ride along on your bike. So Kate go ahead. Is that Hunter?
I was just going to say, I'm not one to ride my bike in 110-degree heat with a lot of humidity, but there are a lot more hardy people than me in these campaigns, I've noticed.
I think it's just fantastic that people are riding along on their bike. So Kate's got some great questions here too. She said she's just outside the Miami city limits. And so she's in Southern Florida there. And she says there's a way that a community like hers can also be a part of this partnership.
Yes.
One quick thing. Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead,
Hunter. That's all you.
You'll probably have, you'll have more to say about that too. But one quick thing to note is that we work with cities of all sizes. And so Roanoke, Virginia is one of the communities that's going forward this year, and that they have a population of about 100,000. And Houston is another, and they have over 2 million people. So we really are interested in mapping the heat island effect in a variety of different places, because it's important to get to have this done in a variety of different kinds of communities. Not only because they all need this information, but also because from a scientific perspective, it's really helpful to have a sample of different kinds of cities so we can understand how the heat island might be different in different climates, different urban structures, things like that. So that's really another reason to do it. And I know that the cities themselves, several of our campaigns are not just in the city, but they're also in the county. And so they've mapped broader areas. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And I'm can't speak on behalf of any of the local organizers in particular, but I'm sure they would be really interested in making those contacts and extending the utility of this information. One thing that we're working on, and it's not quite ready yet, but I've collected information from all the cities, and we're trying to develop city pages so that each place that's being mapped this year, and then we'll eventually go back to the previous years, has just a quick home for their campaign, so you can see who the local partners are, who the lead partner is, a little bit of climate information, and a few other things like that. So that's another great place once that's up to go find this information, to get connected.
Yeah, I agree. Working with a local organizer in Miami to see whether there is a possibility of extending what we'd create these polygons, see if there's ways of extending it into an adjacent community. I think that's one approach. Another one that I'll mention, which is outside the scope of this work, I think, but I'll just briefly mention it, is that part of what we're trying to do here is each year as we do these campaigns, and you heard about past campaigns, we're really trying to get at as much bioclimatic diversity in terms of these campaigns as possible. So if we have, for example, over a few dozen cities that are done over the course of the next few years, what we're really able to do then is use these data combined with satellite data, and combined with a lot of these analytical techniques to be able to create these very high resolution maps for the contiguous United States. And the idea is if we have lots, data, good data in, good data out. And right now, satellite imagery, for example, isn't able to provide humidity. And for many of the communities going this year, humidity is a major concern. And since we'll be picking up on relative humidity going on, we're able to incorporate some of that in terms of a heat index and the health concerns. But ultimately, to create these kind of nationwide descriptions is the pipe dream at this point. But if all things go as planned, we're getting closer and closer to that.
Kate had another question here that I think is, she said, with all the people who are on this call and the partners involved, is the role of journalists in newsrooms. And I think, Kate, that was some of the point of bringing this group together, and people like you are to get this in front of you so you can start thinking about it and start becoming involved so that you can be one of the voices in your community, because I know you do a great job at that. Also, I'll add that John Upton with our partnership journalism program at Climate Central will also be looking to do some collaborations where we co-publish and co-produce stories in some of these cities, because each one of these is going to be a different campaign, and there's going to be different stories to tell in each one of these communities. And that's where it's so great to bring all of you together in this forum so you can start thinking about it and then applying it to your community. We see another one here, Allison Rogers, the best contact for getting the local contact within one of the 13 cities. Tom, is that Monica? Or you?
It's probably Hunter or Monica. I think, as Hunter had mentioned, that one aspect we're trying to do are the city pages, which will have some of that more local information. But again, for the connection to get to the local contact information, your best bet would be to contact Monica Allen, and then she'll be helpful to kind of get you to that local contact, because that is in the end what the hope is with this, to get everyone to connect to that local level and be able to tell those important local stories on extreme heat.
Thanks, Tom. This is Monica. I just wanted to say I think that Hunter had a meeting with the local contacts earlier today, so I think we're ready to send that contact information for each of those to any of the journalists that would like that. We've got the list here, and just let us know. My email's there, and we look forward to helping you with the stories.
That's great.
There you go. Thank you so much, Monica.
And I know we're wrapping up on time, but there's one thing I just kind of wanted to put there, not to push this too much time, but in the world we're living in right now, with COVID and all the unrest and everything here too, how are you all approaching this somewhat differently, or are you, or is this enough of a program that you think, regardless of what's going on, it's kind of got its footing? Anyone?
I mean, in general, I would say that the challenges for people living in these communities are real, and we don't know how the situation will play out this summer. And so the safety of the people involved in these campaigns comes first. And I know we've had conversations about how to make sure that we can safeguard that in planning these campaigns. And I know Vivek's team has gone into a lot of work thinking about every little thing, how to sterilize the gear and things like that. So we have to take the local context is what takes priority, and those local leaders are going to have to determine how we move forward, and we have to be sensitive to the local context of each of these campaigns.
Thank you.
I know we're right at the hour. Bernadette, it's actually linked to one of your earlier comments, I think, regarding the timeliness of this work. We have found through several analyses that we've done in these heat campaigns that the relationship between what has happened historically in each of the cities that we're working with, whether that be racial covenants, whether that be redlining, whether that be other forms of segregation, those communities have historically been in many ways underserved, with whether it be tree canopy, whether it be kind of the kinds of buildings that ameliorate heat. And so what we're finding is this direct relationship between a lot of the questions around racial equity that we're seeing come out today, and in relation to a lot of these extreme heat, exposure to extreme heat. And so this is not again, I go back to my initial point, this isn't a new thing. This has been going on for a really long time, and we're seeing it express itself in really acute ways right now. And I do think it's a very timely piece, and we're taking all the precautions we can, of course, to work with local organizers to ensure a step-by-step process for reducing any pathways of exposure, as well as making sure that we're trying to get the best data that we can from those communities.
Thank you.
I think actually what's going on is really timely too, in more ways than one. I think as a community of journalists, there's a conversation about how we cover this as well. And I would really encourage everyone, when talking about inequity, to think through the language used. So it's not that certain communities of color are predisposed for heat impacts or vulnerability. It's the structural environment that we've created that has put people at risk for this, for health inequities, for lack of tree cover. And that's really, really important in the context of today. I think we should be we're thinking about it on so many levels. And the health of our communities is really at stake here.
I think it's a really great point to end on. I'd like to thank all the panelists and everyone else for attending today. Really great questions. And this is just the beginning of the conversation. You have Monica's email address, you have Bernadette's. And again, all of the slides and the presentation here was recorded. We can share that with everybody else. And looking forward to talking with all of you throughout the rest of the summer, and even to this winter when the maps come out. And hopefully this is just sort of a really fruitful discussion and conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Stay safe out there.
Thanks. Take care.